I was a financial aid professional. So that is what I spent the first chunk of my career doing. I was a financial aid counselor at a small Christian college in Orange County called Vanguard University. And then my last role, where I was for almost 5 years before I joined the Hope Center, was running outreach and communications for the financial aid office at UCLA. So financial aid outreach and communications, as well as helping our admissions office with all of their financial aid related stuff. And you now have the dubious pleasure of working with me on this session. So I'm looking forward to chatting to you all a little bit.
I loved that every time we tried to turn on the AC, snow.
And then mute some folks that maybe don't have themselves on mute. I also want to, before we get into just doing a quick activity and asking you all to do something like an introduction, I want to pause and see if our coaches, any of the Pathways coaches, are on the line and want to. I know that y'all kind of know each other, but want to just briefly say hello and introduce yourself. I see Martha.
Great, Martha Ellis, good to see everyone today. Great to be with you. Thanks, Angelina.
Yeah. Any other coaches on the call? I'm sorry, I can't see everybody.
I don't think I've seen Linda Watkins. She said she might be joining late today.
Okay.
And then Maria.
Okay. Well, we'll move forward then. What I'm going to ask you all to do, we will not make the 50 folks on this call go around and say their names, but I do have 2 requests. The first is that if you just edit your name, there's like 3 little dots at the top of your either your screen with your video or your name, and just add the institution or organization that you're from, just so we know, to your name. And then we're going to do just a quick little activity to get started thinking about financial aid. So I'm going to pull this up. We're going to use something called Menti, just an easy way to kind of get your responses. But pretty much what we want you to think about is the one financial aid regulation or policy practice that you would change or scrap completely if you had the power to do so. So it can be federal, state, institutional, but if you could do whatever you wanted, get rid of or change, what would you do? So the way that we're going to ask you to share this, you can go on your phone or on your computer to menti.com and enter this little code in. Can everyone see this? 80758202. And then you can type in what you would change and it'll show up here. Give you all a second to think about it.
Verification. Lots of verification. Keep the verification rolling. This is very much on theme with we have had these sessions with our friends in New York today and our friends in LA as well, and verification has been a running theme. I'm assuming whoever put collaboration with other departments would like to add more collaboration with other departments rather than get rid of collaboration with other departments. Communicating appeals processes to students as early as possible. We are going to talk about some of that stuff, so that's a really great one today. R2T4s. Okay, I apologize to whoever has their census tomorrow because I know what that means, and I'm very sorry.
That's us.
I'm sorry, Mary Linda. Let's see, dependency status,
That up there.
complexity of forms and processes, R2T4.
I didn't put that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I clearly I missed I misheard who said they had their census day. I can only see a subsection of the people who are on my screen because we've got a lot of you. So again, whoever has census tomorrow, I'm very sorry. Just in general that you have to deal with census tomorrow, aside from having this the day before a busy day. Discontinue practice of not allowing students with balances to register. Okay, there is some really good stuff in here. This is great. Thank you all for sharing. What we're going to do is, so I think it is safe to say that we all would like to change lots of things to do with the financial aid system, and none of us think it's perfect. So that is a good starting point for this conversation today. So there's a couple of things I want to recap on. I just want to recap a little bit of what we put in that pre-work video that I recorded of sort of why we're thinking about these things and why it matters. So the why, I think, is sometimes self-explanatory, but at the end of the day, financial aid is key to ensuring students' basic needs are met. Like getting students funds is a fairly essential part of getting their basic needs met. I have yet to meet a landlord or a grocery store who will allow me to pay with the lint in my pockets rather than with a credit card or cash. And I shared in that presentation some of the extra challenges that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic that I know everybody's pretty familiar with at this point. One of the key ones that I sort of come back to again and again, particularly as somebody who part of my financial aid work was how do we communicate things well to students when it comes to financial aid issues, is the over 50% of students in the surveys we've done who didn't apply for supports because they didn't know how to or that they were eligible. And I often would come up against this like, I have said this 17 different ways to Sunday, how can I get this message across? And realizing, well, if I still have 50+% of my students who don't know that they can apply for emergency aid, or I translate this over to things like financial aid appeals, who likely if they didn't know they could apply for emergency aid, they might not know that they could appeal all kinds of things. Then we need to keep saying these things in as many ways, as many times, and as loudly as we can until as many students as possible know about them. So I also talked in that session about how to keep the focus on students and thinking about where the traffic jams are. So where are the places in the year where, for example, with something like census, where are the times of the year where you end up with a lot of people in your office, a lot of people calling, and what are some of the things you can do about it? And then lastly, I talked a little bit about the sort of challenge that we face in financial aid of the tug of war between advocating for our students and supporting our students and the vast number of compliance requirements that we sit under at the federal level, at the state level, and even sometimes our own sort of institutional requirements. And we have this tug of war because we often talk about financial aid staff in very caring profession ways. A lot of places have financial aid counselors, things like that. Yet when we look at where a lot of our time is spent on the work, and when I think about where a lot of my time was spent on the work as a brand new financial aid counselor, when I first started, it's on things like completing verification requirements. It's on sending out R2T4s. It's on a lot of the compliance stuff. And so thinking through some of the ways that how can we ensure advocacy and care for students while still meeting those compliance requirements, because we still have to live with them. And one thing I want to always make clear is I'm very frustrated at the financial aid system. I'm very rarely frustrated at financial aid staff and people. This was the job I did for 7 or 8 years. I love the work. I love financial aid staff. And I know that a lot of the time the challenge is the system that financial aid sits in. It's not an issue of staff who don't want to care and help for students. It is a system that says you should spend more time on verification than you should advising your students. So I want to make that clear, because sometimes it feels like I'm criticizing financial aid offices and staff when really it's the system we have to work in. So with that, we are going to split off into, because we've got 60 plus people with us today. That's far more than we can have a conversation with one-on-one. So we're going to split into some smaller groups and address 3 questions that I'm just going to drop in the chat in a second. Angelina, if you can start getting us sorted with our breakout rooms. So these are the 3 questions we want to discuss for probably about 20 minutes. So what are the things you're doing at your institutions to introduce care into financial aid, or where do you see the opportunities to do so? Are there institutional policies and practices that could be changed or removed that would enhance equity and care for students? Sometimes we have our own institutional policies that have sat there for a very long time that are hindering students rather than helping, and it's time to review those and see what we can change. And then what obstacles do you see to change, and how could they be overcome? I also, recognize that not everybody in the room has the authority or the power to change policies and procedures overnight. So where are the places where you see changes possible or might be worthwhile, but it would require somebody else making a decision to do that? So with that, I will ask Angelina to split us off into smaller groups. And Angelina and I will come around and do some visiting, and we'll come back in about 20 minutes to talk about some practical ideas we have and then answer some questions.
I am sorting now.
Thank you so much. Themes of your conversations were, or what the big, here are the things we were talking about. So anybody who wants to, if you want to drop it in the chat of what the stuff you were working on or talking about was, and we'll see what themes there are that emerge. With this many people, it's a little bit hard to have folks just calling stuff out. So if you drop it in the chat, and then I'll try and highlight some themes, that would be awesome. I like this setup that Anthony at Tarrant County has here. It looks like you guys are at a nice dining table, like having a meal or something. It's pretty sweet. Waiting for the white glove waiter to bring you both a martini.
We'll be waiting for a while though.
Anthony, don't get carried away. There will be no waiters. You do need to explain to our friends that we have moved to a new structure where we have workstations and meeting rooms to increase collaboration from one area to another. So it's pretty awesome.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Very nice. All right, we've got a couple of things coming into the chat. So Catherine at Dallas College, it's hard advocating for students when your profession is very policy and compliance driven. I think that is always a huge challenge with financial aid, that we sort of have a system that has been set up to insist that we tick an awful lot of boxes every day, while at the same time, we're told, and I think a lot of us, about financial aid is a very caring profession. And it can be feel a little whiplashy to go back and forth between sort of meeting with a student that you're trying to help out and then, completing verifications. Let's see. So federal and state requirements and regulations. Yeah, so that's Fred from McLennan College. I think that's very similar to the point that Catherine's making. There's a definite theme around these issues of it's very hard to adjust when you're hemmed in by regulations on every side. I really like this, lobbying for more time for professional development staff. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen with a couple of projects that we've been running, one project in particular that we've run over the past year. More intentional use of work study funds, obstacles of students who don't apply for a whole bunch of reasons. Yeah. Okay, so let's see, we've got 20 minutes left. I have 3 or 4 slides that I'm going to share on some ideas and sort of practical suggestions where we've seen some sort of evidence of them being useful, and then we'll leave the last 5-10 minutes for some questions, and Angelina then has a couple of sort of pieces of housekeeping and wrap up right at the end. So let me share my screen 1 second here. Okay. So this is sort of part 2 of the pre-work presentation that all of you, or probably not all of you, because I'm a realist, no matter how nicely I did my makeup for you, or probably not everybody watched the video. But for those of you who didn't, go back and take a look when you have time. This is the sort of final section of that. And thinking about some of the ways that it's possible to introduce more care into the financial aid process, and ways to think a little creatively. So one area of that is where can you operate flexibly? So a big piece of what we deal with in financial aid when it comes to supporting students is professional judgment decisions, and using that regulatory flexibility that we have within the financial aid system. And a lot of the time, very understandably, we ask for sort of third-party evidence for things. And the Federal Student Aid Handbook says, where possible, you should collect third-party evidence. But there's also lots of areas where it's advised, not necessarily a requirement, and you can make decisions based on the judgment of a financial aid professional if you choose to. I recognize some of the reluctance to do that often comes out of having been smacked around for a bad audit finding, or for a finding in a program review, and there's a very justified fear there of, well, if we don't dot every I and cross every T, then we're going to get in trouble for something. And something that one of the financial aid directors in our session this morning with some of the institutions that are participating in this process from New York said, which I really liked, was part of being, a good financial aid director is operating in the gray areas that exist within the sort of appeals processes and within professional judgment. And he said, so long as I feel comfortable writing it down and documenting it, then I'm comfortable defending it to an auditor. And I think that was a really key piece of documentation is important, but that can include your own documentation as a financial aid professional. Things like when we make determinations on a student's dependency status due to homelessness or potentially homelessness. And third-party evidence is great, but you can meet with the student and make that determination yourself as a financial aid professional. And I like this view of, if you're willing to write it down and explain what you did, then you're operating within that gray area. If you're doing something where you're no longer willing to write it down because it feels a little bit iffy, well, you probably push past that gray area. And I thought that was a nice way of thinking about this challenge of how do we stay in compliance while still really doing our best to care for students. Another piece of this was staff having the ability to make those kinds of discretionary decisions and feeling confident doing so. We are wrapping up a project called The Real Price of College that had six Texas institutions, some of whom are represented here. So Dallas College has been part of this, in some cases more senior leadership than frontline financial aid staff. But one of the things we did was we asked all of the financial aid staff at the 6 colleges, what are the most prevalent supports outside of financial aid on your campuses? And the 2 that came back from the most people were emergency aid, and this was before the pandemic, and benefits access support. And we said, okay, great. We're going to do a couple of little training sessions on just giving frontline financial aid staff a little bit more context on those 2 programs. And these were not complex trainings. They were hour-long webinars. So somebody in the chat had mentioned about professional development. We know everybody's time is limited, so we did hour-long webinars. We did one on emergency aid, and we did one on benefits access. And we asked all of the staff before we ran these trainings, how much do you know about these 2 areas, and how comfortable are you referring students to them? And then we did the same survey afterwards. And we had a sort of significant increase in the number of staff who said that they were more comfortable, or that they were comfortable referring students to things like benefits access and emergency aid. And so it doesn't have to be, as you think about sort of cross-training and areas where you can support students, it doesn't have to be that everybody has to know everything. That's not realistic. Sometimes it can just be enough to give staff enough information so they feel comfortable referring students to a program. And you can increase the number of staff who feel comfortable doing that, and from there, the number of students who get referred to those kinds of supports. The other thing that's often overlooked and is worth considering is where are there places to connect processes? So obviously we've done more in the past 18 months with emergency aid than I think anybody would have reasonably expected before the pandemic began. And financial aid offices have lifted heaven and earth to do so. With HERF dollar emergency aid, with the CARES Act and onwards, that doesn't have to be sort of part of the student's cost of attendance. But at least in the moment, regular emergency aid that comes from sort of your own institutional dollars has and continues to be, has to fit within a student's cost of attendance. So a really simple part of connecting processes can be, if a student's approved for an emergency aid application, you also get them the budget adjustment request as well to make sure that there's room within their financial aid package and their cost of attendance to fit that emergency aid in. Otherwise, you end up with the situation where you're putting the emergency aid in and you're removing loan dollars or something else potentially to make room for it. And the student is better off in the long run. They've borrowed a little bit less, but that's not helping them with the immediate emergency. Something that we did when I was at UCLA was we would auto-generate notices to students who had a dependent listed on their FAFSA to tell them that if they needed to, they could request a budget adjustment for childcare costs. And so we just automated that process. If somebody had a dependent listed, they got a notification. And not all of those students had young children who needed childcare. Sometimes they had adult dependents, sometimes they had teenagers who were, were able to come and go as they please. But I knew that telling more students than needed the support about the fact that it was available was always going to help me reach the students who really needed it. And also recognizing that you don't always have money to fill in that extra, just because somebody's budget gets increased doesn't mean you've got extra dollars to give them, but at least gives them the opportunity, if they want to maybe pursue a private loan, to pursue an additional source of funds that you've created some room for. The last piece I've actually sort of talked about with the cross training, but when it comes to like informing, giving your staff enough information so that they can refer students to different places. But this goes both ways, because I know we've got lots of people on the call who aren't necessarily in financial aid offices, but are in different roles where you still address these issues and come across these issues. So this can go both ways, where you want financial aid staff to have enough information about some of these available resources to send students to them, but also to have, student success coaches or benefits coordinators or basic needs coordinators to have enough information about financial aid so that when a student comes in and says, I'm in X, Y, or Z situation, they know enough to say, okay, I can help you with A, B, and C. For issue D, I'm going to send you over to my friend in the financial aid office so that they can work with you over there, because that's going to be part of their role. And finding those ways that financial aid can support other offices and other offices can support financial aid by connecting students to the resources they need. Because the reality is that all of our institutions and campuses are complex places to navigate, and we have a lot of students who have likely never, in many cases, never attended college before, or they're still figuring this out. They don't have somebody in their family to go to help them figure it out. And that's how we can help people sort of navigate these situations. Okay, so those are a few, by no means exhaustive, but a few ideas for things to consider. We have, let's see, we've got just over 10 minutes left. So I'm going to give 6 or 7 minutes to questions. And to make this a little bit easier to manage, if you do have a question or you want to share something, can you use the little the little reaction to raise your hand? Because if we get a whole bunch of people unmuting and trying to talk at once, we're going to end up with a big old traffic jam. So if you want to ask something, if you want to share something, if you use the little raise your hand reaction, and we'll spend a few minutes on questions, and then we will wrap up at about 5 till. I was told this was the party group.
Can I maybe prompt Fred Hills from McLennan to say a little bit more, if you're willing, about your idea of faculty sharing information and putting banners on the LMS. Is that something that you're currently doing or something that you'd like to do?
That came up during our conversation. Actually the question came up is how can faculty involved in the process? And faculty members were sharing ways that we also, in a certain sense, use faculty, but how can you, is there prepackaged information to make students aware of the possibilities, ways that we can help them, make them more aware? We also have the banners on your learning management systems that might be able to, this is time to consider this. We do have sometimes when faculty will say, if you haven't filled this particular form, haven't gotten this done, you've got so much time to do it. Just to help faculty be involved in the process, since that's really the person the student sees in their educational journey. One thing the faculty did ask is for prepackaged information, which makes sense because none of them are experts in financial aid, but they could be a conduit for that information. That's what was shared.
I think that's really great. It's actually, so this sort of tracks on for Sarah, our boss in the Hope Center, we've had for a while a basic needs statement that we've encouraged faculty to put into their syllabi, where, if a student's struggling with meeting their basic needs, encouraging them to speak to their professor who isn't going to necessarily deal with the issue, but can send them to the right person to help with the issue. And the putting things on your student portal or your LMS, particularly, one thing that I was able to sweet talk my way into at UCLA was when students logged into their student portal, the sort of sticky banners that pop up that they have to acknowledge before they can move on and do anything else. At a few key times of the year, I was able to get the folks who ran our student portal to agree that things like, Christopher talked about census. So things like in the few weeks before census, we would have reminders pop up as soon as students logged in of, for financial aid purposes, you have to be enrolled in X number of units by this date. Please ensure that you are so you don't lose financial aid eligibility, things like that. And that's sort of one of the things I talked about in the presentation was identifying your pain points throughout the year of where do we see students running into issues, or where do we have a lot of people calling or a lot of people in our office, and thinking about what are the proactive communications we can put out into the world in the few weeks before those pain points to help try and, you're not going to relieve all of them. You're still going to end up with some calls and with some students in your office. But, every student that you help resolve that issue before they end up on the phone is more time that you can spend with the students who weren't able to resolve it. So I think there's some great ideas there from Fred. Thank you so much. One other question or something that somebody wants to share coming out of their discussion groups before we wrap up? Or do we need to send you all martinis? Yes, Martha.
I have a quick question from what you've learned from other states you're working with, as well as Texas. What have we learned during COVID-19 and the disbursement of emergency aid and other funds that will help us going forward to meet students' basic needs and other needs?
So that is a wonderful question, because it sets me up beautifully to say that is actually going to be primarily the topic of the next session. So the next session is all focused. This was more sort of financial aid, generally speaking. The next session is going to be very specifically focused on emergency aid. I will say that the biggest thing that we've seen as a huge challenge is how long it takes schools to get emergency aid out the door. So I'm actually in the middle of helping to write it. We're going to have a couple of reports coming out this fall on a project that we've done over the past year as institutions dispersed CARES Act money, and how challenging it was to move money fast. The average time was close to 2 weeks, which in financial aid world, frankly, is pretty dang fast. In the context of I need money tomorrow to pay for rent is not fast enough. And that's a real challenge of like trying to meet in the middle there. But that will be the next session that, as I hand over to Angelina, she can talk about. That's going to be where we're going to focus that next session on, is all of the emergency aid issues and some of the best practices that we've learned through the course of that project as well. It's a great question. With that, it is back to you, Angelina. And thank you all so much for the great discussions and the great questions and everything else. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Thanks, everyone, as Eddie said, for joining us today. I know it's always hard to come back after a holiday, and it sounds like beginning of term is a busy time. So I just want to first express our gratitude and appreciation for y'all joining us today. I want to do a quick reminder that the next session is on emergency aid. That's going to be on October 12th at 1 p.m. I'll send out some more information, and you'll get an invite from Cynthia Farrell at the Texas Success Center. The other thing that I want to just ask, I am going to put just a little link to a session evaluation that you can fill out now, or it'll be included again in the follow-up email that I send to if you want to take some time to think about it. We're also going to be sending some additional resources related to the financial aid conversation that we just had for you to look back on as well. So filling out that session evaluation is really helpful for us so that we know, like, was this helpful for you? Could we change anything to be better next time? We did a little bit of a different approach this time with some of the pre-video. And so curious to see if that was helpful or not. So thank you in advance for filling that out. And I think that is all on my end. Martha, anything else that you want to add? No? Okay.
Nope, thank you.
Awesome. Well, if that is the case, then I will say thank you again, and we will see you all in October.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Good to see you.
Bye, thanks.